Hey there, this is Dr. Trussell. Let's go through Chapter 3 briefly of the Giancola textbook program evaluation. This chapter is on evaluation ethics, and again, as I always do, I encourage you to go back and read through the chapter for the details. I'm just going to give a brief summary. So we start by defining ethics. So the dictionary, Merriam-Webster, defines ethics as the discipline dealing with what is good and bad, a set of moral issues or aspects. So ethical behavior is a requirement of all researchers, but there's a little bit different requirement, as we'll see, for general researchers like scientific researchers and this subcategory of research that is evaluation. So we'll look at what ethical behavior in program evaluation means as evaluation attempts to contribute to program improvement and accountability. Also, evaluation in many ways differently than other types of research has to deal with things that occur in the real world that we can't control, like we might be able to in a lab sort of setting or an experimental sort of setting. So there's some different considerations that we have to take as evaluators than we would if we were doing sort of pure research that's not applied in the sense that evaluation research is. So just a brief history of ethics guidelines and legislation. The Nuremberg Code is a set of guidelines for ethics specifically applied to medical types of research that came out of the trials against German physicians after World War II. So when some of the atrocities of what was done to humans in Germany during World War II started to come out, we got from that what's called the Nuremberg Code, which gave a list of ethical guidelines for research on humans. You can read through the details of that Nuremberg Code in your text. So it was a set of guidelines, but it didn't hold any actual weight or legal teeth. No one was required to follow those guidelines. And so we continue to see additions to that throughout the years that follow. So next we got about 15 years later, the Medical Association, World Medical Association General Assembly adopted what they called the Declaration of Helsinki. It defined what it means to be a human subject. It's a living individual who participates in a research study, either directly or indirectly. And it gave 37 principles guiding ethical behavior, specifically in terms of biomedical research, but the responsibilities that are listed in the Declaration of Helsinki really extend to any researcher. The intent of the declaration is that the responsibility extends to any researcher who participates in human subjects research, not only those who are doing biomedical research. So then, in the U.S., after the Tuskegee syphilis study, which we discussed in the last chapter, which was a just grossly unethical treatment of African American males being studied with syphilis, we get in the U.S. the National Research Act, which requires informed consent, which is part of what was an issue in the Tuskegee study, that those who were involved in the study didn't know what they were being, what was happening to them, what was being studied. And it also develops what's called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. An IRB is a committee that's charged with protecting human subjects in research. They review all research prior to the beginning of a research project to make sure that adequate protections and safeguards are in place to protect human subjects. Then the Belmont Report comes to be in 1979, formally titled Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research, but commonly referred to as the Belmont Report. It's named after the center, the conference center where the meetings took place when it was designed. It's sort of the seminal document guiding human subjects research. Most of what was in the Belmont reports still exists today as guidelines for human subjects research. Ethical principles that are outlined are respect for persons, beneficence, which if you don't know what that word means and had to look it up like I did, just means doing good. It comes from the same root word as benefit. So you want to be sure that your research benefits folks, and justice. Researchers should treat all individuals fairly and equally. In 2018, we get the revised Common Rule, which reduces some of the burden of researchers. We get new guidelines for IRB, which in a sense excludes some projects from needing IRB review and allows some projects to go through an expedited IRB review, just depending on the nature of the project and how involved the human subjects research will be. They may have to undergo a little less review than previously. They recommended creation of a standard IRB that would review all human subjects research, but that recommendation was not implemented. However, it also included this federal-wide assurance, FWA, which states that an organization will comply with human research regulations. It's just required of any organization that accepts federal funding is required to comply with IRB and other ethical standards for human research. IRB, just if you've never heard of it or never gone through the process of IRB approval, this chapter lays out a nice summary of what that looks like. Any researcher who wants to do research involving human subjects is required to go through IRB approval for that research project prior to even beginning the project. And so often that begins with having some form of IRB training. Some institutions have their own in-house training, others use other types of training. One common type is from the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative, CITI training. If you take our research methods class here, you will earn that certificate of training. And then you'll submit, after you've received the training, now you'll actually submit your protocol to the IRB. This is really the heart of your submission. This tells IRB what you plan to do, how it involves human subjects, what survey questions you plan to ask, what experimental procedures you plan to employ, things like that. And then you wait, and you wait, and oftentimes IRB comes back asking you for a few amendments. Cool, this looks great, but these are some things we would change to make sure that you do no harm. And then you just resubmit having made those changes, and you wait again. And once you finally get through the IRB approval process and you're told this is approved, we agree that you're doing no harm, then you're able to begin your research. So those are ethical guidelines of any researcher. IRB applies to all researchers of any type. And then the chapter here shifts to look at some things that are really specific to evaluators as a subgroup of researchers. So the AEA gives the guiding principles for evaluators, which we've encountered in previous chapters already. And those principles require systematic inquiry, which says evaluators should conduct systematic, well-planned evaluations that are data-based, comprehensive, and relevant. They require competence, so the evaluator should be capable and skilled in the things that they're doing. They require integrity. Evaluators should conduct their work with honesty and transparency. They require respect for people, value and honor the dignity of persons and populations involved, take into account cultural contexts, for example. And lastly, common good and equity. So the principle of common good and equity requires that evaluators make concerted efforts to make contributions to the good of all and the advancement of society that's equitable, fair, and just. So one of the AEA guiding principles for evaluators is that evaluators should be competent. And so then they also sort of define what they mean by that. So what does it mean for an AEA evaluator to be competent? They have expectations across 5 domains. One is professional practice. So a competent evaluator is one who is knowledgeable of and uses guiding principles for evaluators, program evaluation standards, and the AEA statement of cultural competence. Methodology. A competent evaluator uses systematic inquiry, adopts appropriate evaluation designs, produces credible evaluations. Context. A competent evaluator is one who takes the time to understand the context of a program, including the environment, the stakeholders, the culture, the values, and history. Planning and management. A competent evaluator plans appropriately, safeguards data, supervises evaluation processes, monitors their progress, and they're mindful of their resources and their timelines. And finally, interpersonal skills, which says that a competent evaluator is one who is able to communicate orally and written, and who is mindful of the culture in which they're operating. That's cultural competence. They further define what they mean by cultural competence. So the AEA cultural competence statement clarifies expectations in cultural competence, or an awareness of stakeholders' needs, those who are involved in the evaluation or the program that's being evaluated. It's important for the evaluator to understand their culture and their needs. The AEA cultural competence statement provides essential practices for culturally competent evaluators. And those are that the evaluators should acknowledge the complexity of cultural identity, recognize the dynamics of power, recognize and eliminate bias in language, and employ culturally appropriate methods. Next, evaluators have to consider confidentiality and privacy. So privacy refers to protection of people, and confidentiality, protection of their data. Confidentiality, of course, is sort of a subset of privacy. If your data is not kept confidential, then it can be a violation of one's privacy. And it's important to note that confidentiality and privacy don't just mean that you should remove any names and addresses and phone numbers and things like that from your data, but there's also this idea of deductive disclosure. You need to be mindful of this. So deductive disclosure happens when someone's identity can be determined through responses or combinations of responses. You may have taken their name out of it, but if you give enough information that it's clear, can be clear, or can be figured out who they are, then you still haven't maintained their confidentiality. So an example from the textbook is if you're giving information about, you're sharing information maybe in a newspaper about scores on a test for high school seniors, and you break it down by race and gender, and there are only two males of a particular race in the high school, and then it may be really simple, really easy to figure out who scored what, or what those males' scores are. And so in that way, you've violated this confidentiality through deductive disclosure. Though you never said their names, you gave enough information for folks to figure out who they were and what their scores were. So all these guidelines, ethical guidelines of how we should do things to remain above board and to keep from doing any harm to our human subjects in any of our research. What happens when things go awry? Something unanticipated or adverse occurs, like you get some data from a source that's not de-identified, that does have names associated with it, and you open up your file and you're like, oh shoot, I'm not supposed to have this information. This was supposed to be de-identified. I wasn't supposed to know the people's names. What do you do? Number one, and really mostly all you need to remember, is you should immediately contact IRB. Whoever your IRB is at your organization that approved your study. When something unanticipated or adverse goes on, you contact IRB, tell them what happened, and they'll give you guidance for addressing the problem. The last thing here is something that most of us are probably familiar with as an ethical guideline, but that is to keep in mind always the potential for conflict of interest. If there is potential, even if you believe that as an evaluator you'll be able to remain objective, if there is any potential of conflict of interest, you need to acknowledge that. You need to describe it in your IRB application, and if you're then still approved by IRB to conduct the research or the evaluation, then in your report at the end, you still should acknowledge and state the potential for conflict of interest. You need to be as open and honest about that as possible. Preferably avoid that, but sometimes we can't. And sometimes we're the only one around to do the evaluation, for example, or different circumstances may mean that you can't really completely avoid the potential for conflict of interest, but anytime that potential is there, it needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be clearly stated, so that anyone who is using your results or viewing your evaluation report understands where it came from and what the potential conflicts were.